All right. Today's topic, we advertised Pakistani pluralism in the 21st century. Yes, we will talk about that. I'm not sure how many of you are from Pakistan or have lived in Pakistan or follow Pakistani politics and the news and whatever. It certainly will be very informative. But we have a bonus. We'll also have a short presentation. Part of the presentation will be on Jainism. And I'll explain that in a minute. Firstly, our speaker, Dr. Iqbal Akhtar, who is an extremely busy person. And I'm so thankful to him for making time for us this afternoon. He travels a lot, he does research, he writes papers, he teaches classes. He's everywhere. I don't know how he manages all that, but he's still young, so he can manage, I'm sure. He is managing. He's an associate professor with a dual appointment in the departments of religious studies and politics and international relations in the Stephen J. Green School of International and Public Affairs. He teaches both undergraduate and graduate courses, as well as independent studies, including Islamic political thought, advanced interpretations of the Quran, voice of the Prophet, Islamic faith and society, women in Islam, and Islamic mysticism, Sufism. He is the research director of the Western Indian Ocean Studies program and director of the Jain Studies program at Florida International University. Dr. Akhtar has also contributed scholarly papers to various academic publications. He is a busy man. And again, thank you so much for joining us. I'll hand it over to you, Dr. Akhtar.
Thank you so much for having me. Assalamu alaikum. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. So thank you so much for having me. So this semester, I'm currently also the chair for the study of Jainism at Florida International University, which is the first university in the United States to have been endowed by the Jain community. They endowed basically about $1 million in our university to begin the study of Jainism. And since then, they've invested about $4 million across the United States, 15 chairs, to bring greater awareness and rigor to the study of Jainism. And I think it's a really interesting and important model for us to think about as a community, and kind of how we think of investing our money and thinking about how to develop a longer term legacy with regards to education. So I'll talk a little bit about Jainism, and then I'm also currently a Fulbright scholar as well in Pakistan. And I'll talk about kind of the situation that I'm working with in Pakistan and kind of the work that I'm doing. So I'll just begin with Jainism. For those of you who don't know anything about Jainism, we'll talk about, there are kind of four major sort of topics that we'll talk about today. But to give you just kind of a larger sense of what Jainism is, Jainism has an idea of an absolute respect for life, and then also being able to in similarity to other Indic traditions, trying to develop a detachment from the material in order to ascend to a higher spiritual being. And that's kind of what Jainism does as well. It's trying to think about how do we live in this world physically, and what are the spiritual dimensions of living that life. So it doesn't see the world purely as materialist. And I think that's one of the advantages, I think, of the tradition, and how you're supposed to sort of interact with people that have different ideas and can conceive of the world in different ways. And Jainism sort of gives different ways of being able to interact with different types of people. So the question is, what is Jainism? So Jainism believes that it is a tradition that goes back hundreds of thousands of years, if not millions of years. So it's part of sort of an Indic worldview in which time is cyclical. It's very different from Islam, in which there's a beginning point with Hazrat Adam, and then there's an end point of Qiyamah. So in the Indic traditions, life in sort of time and civilization is created and destroyed, created and destroyed. So there are 24 Tirthankaras, or these what they call forward makers or guides, essentially. You can think of them as maybe as prophets from our tradition. And Mahavira would have been the last one. And that was about sort of 2,500 years ago. He existed during the time of the Buddha. In fact, the Jains believe that their tradition is older than Buddhism, that one of the paths of the Buddha, especially at the time of the renunciation and sort of extreme fasting, was actually a Jain. He was following a Jain guide and then sort of veered from that and sort of developed his own middle path. Like the Buddha, Mahavira was also from the Kshatriya, from the royal caste, and decides to again abandon the caste identity and the material and the political sort of power that he had to be able to achieve spiritual enlightenment. So there are 23 Tirthankaras before Mahavira, and Mahavira is sort of the last of the great Tirthankaras. And the idea is that Jainism, in many ways, is part of what's called the Shramana tradition. So it fought against the caste system of Hinduism. And that's something that's important to understand, is that it sees itself, nowadays, Jains are kind of lumped in as sort of Hindus and within sort of Hindu nationalist politics, but in terms of its theology, it has very different perspectives. The idea of nonviolence is very different from the idea of nonviolence within Hinduism. In fact, the idea of Gandhian nonviolence really comes from Jainism. It's not really Hindu nonviolence. So that's something that's very important to understand. So what I'm doing is I'm giving you kind of the broad ideas of Jainism. I'm moving to the slides very quickly just to give you the general ideas. And then you're more than welcome to go deeper into the tradition, and you're more than welcome to, I can provide sort of other links and materials for you to go deeper. Two groups essentially that develops the Digambaras and the Shvetambars, and their theological reasons in terms of how they understand the Jain scriptures, if they believe that the Jain scriptures are somewhat intact, or if they were all lost and had to be reconstructed. And then again, in the most physical sense, you actually have monks that some of them in the Digambara situation, they're nude, and the Shvetambars, they actually wear clothing. So it's kind of the more physical manifestation of the larger theological sort of differences within the tradition. So what are some basic principles to think about when we're trying to understand Jainism? One is that Jainism, unlike Buddhism, does believe in a soul. So it has this idea of the jiva, or the soul is something that's immortal and something that is important to understand. And so one of the things that happens is that as we live our lives, as we act within sort of the cycle, this samsaric cycle of birth, death, and rebirth, we're accumulating karma, and the karma in a way can be thought of something physical that attaches itself to the soul, and that weighs us down and forces us back into this cycle of samsara. And so what we're trying to do through our lives is trying to live a life, ideally, to stop creating karma, and then also doing things that helps to destroy old karma so that we're able to attain final liberation. Right. And the jina is kind of in a way similar to the idea of a bodhisattva, in which someone who has been able to fully conquer all of the passions of humanity and sort of life, and is able to sort of transcend this reality. I talked a little bit about this idea of karma, that it's actually matter that attaches itself to the soul, that creates the connection to samsara that needs to be eliminated. And within the cycle, we see within Buddhism, within Hinduism, and many other traditions, Hinduism as well, there are many ways that you can be reborn. You can be reborn in the hell realms. You can be reborn sort of in different stages of sort of the human world. You know, as animals, as plants. You can be reborn into the realm of the gods, but the human birth is a very important one and one of the highest stages of life, because it's within the human realm that you have the capacity to be able to make great changes that allows your that can kind of change the destiny of the spirit and allow it to get closer towards ultimate liberation. And Kevala is sort of that idea of the highest form of perfection. So when we think about modern Jainism has three central tenets of the tradition. The first idea is this idea of nonviolence, or Ahimsa, and this translates into very radical nonviolence, I could say. So that nonviolence is not just about not killing other things. So it's not just about not killing other animals, but it can be also about how you're dealing with insects. It could be violence can be done through thoughts, through actions. So many different types of violence. I mean, violence towards even in sort of eating, right? Not eating potatoes and sort of onions or things that in which you have to kill the plant in order to eat it, right? So there, it goes much further than Hinduism does, and even Buddhism in a way. So that's the idea of nonviolence, and the ways in we think of how routine violence impacts the world, impacts the people around us, and how it helps to create a world of disorder. So thinking through that, Ahimsa and this type of nonviolence can help to create a more ordered world and a more harmonious world. The second is the idea of Aparigraha, that you can sort of live a life without being attached to the material, the fruits of that life. So how do we live a life in which we can both interact with the world around us, but not be tied down to it? So how can we have a job and make money, but not be attached to that money, right? And what happens to us as we become attached to our money, or we become attached to possessions, how that creates ideas of rank and hierarchy and our attachment to power. These are all illusions that separate us from our true self and helps to perpetuate this idea of samsara. And the third idea is Anekantwad, or the idea of non-absolutism. The idea that you can actually hold multiple perspectives, so that when you're trying to interact with anything or anyone, you're able to understand that multiple perspectives on a topic, on an issue of a person can exist at the same time. So that allows you to be able, it's kind of in modern terms, we would say pluralism, but it goes much deeper than that. And it is a belief that you can, I don't know if we think of kind of like quantum physics, this idea that an atom can have multiple states at the same time, right? So Anekantwad kind of is something like that. The idea that multiple perspectives, multiple stages of being can exist at the same time. And so that forces the mind to go beyond this binary, us or them, me or the other, that these are illusions, that ultimately all things are connected. So Ahimsa, again, this idea of nonviolence, but it goes really beyond this idea of just killing things. And it can mean thinking about how do we have an impact on the living world. And it's not just the living world, that everything has a life to it. So there are 1 sense beings, 2 sense beings, 3 sense beings. Humans, of course, are 5 sense beings, but water has life within it. Fire has life within it. Air has life within it. All of these things have life. And so we want to live a life in which we have a minimal impact on the destruction of life in this world. And of course, that has a big impact, I think, a good message for us in the era of climate change. As I talked about Aparigraha, this idea of non-attachment, how do we live with the bare minimum? How do we have things but not possess things? How do we gain power as we get older but not be attached to that power? How do we gain wealth but not be attached to that wealth, right? So these are really important concepts, because it's the illusions of wealth and power and all these sorts of things that unfortunately makes humans do very nasty things to other humans, or do nasty things or destructive things to the world. So we have to understand that we can live in the world without being attached to the fruits, right? To act without being attached to the fruits of our actions. Those are very important sort of concepts, right? Within Jainism. And then the last one, as I said, this idea of Anekantwad, right? There's this ancient story, the parable of the elephant, blind people touching an elephant. The one that thinks of a trunk sees the elephant as sort of being elongated, et cetera, et cetera. So there are many different perspectives and ways of understanding. And in order to fully grasp a situation, we need to embrace multiple perspectives. So the truth in that sense is not an absolute, it's not a one or zero. It's multiple. And so we need to embrace that, the subtleties of reality in order to understand truth. So one of the highest ideals for Jains is the idea of asceticism. So you actually have two categories of how to be Jain. One is the ascetics, the people who renounce the world and focus their life on meditation and trying to aspire to the highest ideals of nonviolence and things like that. And then you have the householders, the average people. They have to have a job, have a family, they have to work, right? And so you have different levels of how much you can sort of pursue the path of Jainism. So you have, for the ascetics, of course, it's very strict in terms of what you can eat, what you can do, how you interact with the world. And for the lay people, it gives you certain vows that you just have to accept as you sort of live your life, to try to be a more ethical person. So maybe you're not able to attain enlightenment in this world, but by doing good things, you're able to go into a better rebirth, and eventually you're able to achieve it perhaps in future lifetimes. At least you're able to decrease the amount of karma you're creating, or even burn off some negative karma as you go. So what are the vows? The vow of nonviolence, truthfulness, not stealing, improper sexual activity outside of marriage, limiting how much you gain in terms of possessions, sort of limiting the impact that you have on the environment around you, the quantity of stuff, being more purposeful in the way that you act, idea of meditating every day for at least 48 minutes, reducing, again, this idea of non-virtuous activity, fasting, and then also giving to the mendicants, to the monks and nuns, food, sustenance, things like that, so that they're able to practice and perpetuate the tradition, and also being able to go to a higher state towards enlightenment, and being able to teach the community over time. So there is technically no priesthood within Jainism. So simply the monks and the nuns are not priests, but they're simply teachers. They're people who are of a higher spiritual discipline, and they teach the laity they guide them towards sort of nonviolence, and all of these sort of ideas of Jainism. There is, for some Jains, towards the end of their life, this idea of Salehana, or sort of an ultimate fast to death, but it's very rare, I think. But again, this idea that you're doing ultimate nonviolence, you're not destroying life, you're completely being nonviolent, and then you eventually sort of die as a result of that. So that's kind of an extreme manifestation, and it's not something that's very common. But again, this is one of the ideals that exist within Jainism. And generally what happens is that Jainism develops as a tradition that is characterized by meditation, renunciation, fasting, the study of scriptures and hymns. So there's a whole cultural world that then develops within this tradition as well. So even we think about Buddhism and Jainism, they both react against Hinduism, initially are philosophies, but those philosophies then turn into religions themselves, with cultures and ideas and festivals in their own right. So Diwali, which we have just celebrated, is venerated by the Hindus for different reasons, for the Jains by different reasons, and it's believed that that's the day that Mahavira, the last Tirthankar, the last Jinnah, attained liberation. You also have this festival of atonement for 8 days or 10 days, I believe, depending on which tradition you are, called Paryushan. And each of the days are attributed to different sort of aspects of renunciation, of meditation, of asking for forgiveness, things like that. And you have multiple pilgrimage sites all across India, of the Tirthankars, and of course in Gujarat, there's a very famous area where they have many different sort of temples, and all of these stories of the Tirthankars are remembered. All right, so there are not many Jains worldwide, only 4.5 million Jains. In the United States, there are only 200,000 Jains, so it's a very small community, but a very wealthy community, similar to the Parsis and other small Indian religious communities. One of the challenges of Jainism, why Jainism has not spread outside of India compared to Buddhism, which has spread all over the world, is there were a lot of restrictions with regards to what the monks can and cannot do. One of the challenges is that the monks were never allowed to leave India for the most part. So they were forbidden from crossing the Kalapani, right, the deep ocean. And they were basically subjected to living in Asia and then again with their communities and stuff like that. They were not able to leave the way that they were in Buddhism. So in the 1980s, you have Acharya Tulsi, and there's kind of a reformation of the tradition, and they create a new category of, a semi-ordained nuns and monks, and those people were able to travel worldwide. And so you see not only a diaspora of Jains all over the world, but you actually have Shramanis who are from India who now travel to the West and are able to provide spiritual training and guidance to communities all across the world. So you see in the 20th century kind of a revision of Jainism in order to adapt to the modernity of globalization. All right, so that's that. I guess what I can do is I can, if you have any questions on Jainism, maybe I can answer those now and then we can go to the next, or I can just go straight to the next presentation. I'm not sure.
I don't see anything in the chat. Are there any questions? If you can raise your hand or just put it in the chat and we can deal with that now. Okay. Oh yes, Nasir Jafar. Okay, just a minute, Nasir. I will unmute you. Yeah, you can unmute yourself, Nasir.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. So very quickly, a brilliant presentation. My quick question would be, with your findings based on a broad understanding of ancient wisdom, how would you approach Quran in today's time relative to 7th century texts?
Is this related to Jainism? Nasir, this presentation was on Jainism. Questions on Jainism. Quran session will be at a different time. Is this related to Jainism?
Yeah, with his understanding of Jainism, and I take it broad understanding of ancient wisdom, what might be his findings and understanding relative to 7th century texts, i.e. Quran, if you feel this is not appropriate currently or the right forum, or you would want to take it at the end, it's up to you.
I mean, that's fine. I think that, I think that you have broadly within, I think the development of sort of, within sort of Islam as well, the history of Islam in South Asia, for instance, you have the kind of the, I have a colleague of mine who's works on Indian history, and I think you have kind of two streams within Indian history. So if we think of the ancient Mughals, we have kind of the the Aurangzeb approach to Islam and the Dara Shikoh approach to Islam. So I think that you can think of Islam either as its own world and its own tradition, and it's self-referential, and it is its own thing, and it's immune to any other ideas. And it's its own world of legal orthodoxy. And then you can think of Islam as a tradition that is connected to all of the other traditions of the past. And so one of the ways that within the Islamic tradition that's understood is that all of these people, for instance, could have been prophets in the past, so that each of the other religious traditions of the ancient world and the modern world have elements of truth, because God is infinite and eternal, and the human mind is limited and immortal. So in each tradition, in every idea, there exists truth that we can learn from, and that can better illuminate the truth of the Quran. So I think that's more broadly, I think that's kind of the approaches that Muslims have taken in terms of thinking about pre-Islamic religious traditions in South Asia, and then sort of non-Islamic traditions kind of more generally. Yeah.
Nasir, I know there'll be follow-up questions, but maybe we can take that up later on after the second one. But I have two more
Thank you very much.
Okay,
yeah, sure.
Thanks. Can a person be successful in a modern world by following Jain spiritual practices?
Yeah, so I think that's a very good question. I think absolutely. I mean, when you look at some of the top CEOs in Silicon Valley are Jains, so they're doing very, very well materially, and they again, I think every religious tradition is about it's about your own interpretation of that tradition. So of course, the people that are working in Silicon Valley that are Jains are not monks and nuns, but they believe that they're good practicing Jains, and they try to live, a vegan lifestyle, for instance. So, in terms of their diet, they try to incorporate nonviolence in the way that they manage people that they work with. So there are ways of integrating, the ancient wisdom of Jainism and then sort of the modern life. So I don't think that those are incompatible. Yeah.
Right. Next question is, excuse me, how the three key principles of Jainism, how are they different from similar principles that are in Islam?
Yeah, so I think that ideas that exist within Islam and Jainism, there is overlap. I think the question is to what extent is that there, and how do they interpret it? So we can also argue that in certain ways, Islam does believe in ideas of nonviolence towards people, but at the same time, we also know that there's a history of warfare in Islam. There's a history most Muslim cultures, people eat meat, things like that, right? So the question is not that do the ideas exist in Islam? Of course, these ideas are shared across religions and civilizations. The question is, how do you interpret it, and to the extent that you apply it? Yeah.
Okay, and one question from me.
Sure.
They don't believe in God, right?
So that's a good question. Technically, there's no God in Jainism in the way that we would understand it as Allah in our tradition. That's at a larger philosophical level. I think at a lived religion perspective. So again, whenever we're thinking about religion, there are different levels at which people are operating and understanding religion. So I think at a lived religions perspective, average Jains, you would see them, at least at a practical level, it would appear to people as if there are murtis, there are gods that are being sort of worshipped, right, in temples, and particularly sort of the murti pujaks tradition. So you would see that. So I think that's. So at a philosophical sort of level, no, there exists no gods. That's not. I mean, there exist gods in the sense that the world has gods and goddesses, right? But to achieve liberation, the gods are not instrumental in liberation, that the individual has a capacity to go beyond that. So Buddhism, the same way, it's kind of an atheistic tradition, but it doesn't discount the idea that there exist gods in the universe. But you don't need a God in order to achieve liberation, right? So I don't know if that helps to clarify that a little bit.